What Moves the Dead is my first experience with American author T. Kingfisher. I've got another one of her books ready to go and I cannot wait to read it. But What Moves the Dead is a short and curious retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. A few years ago, I went on a tirade through the works of Edgar Allan Poe, and I found that his short stories were particularly powerful and moving, but his poetry never really affected me, except for The Raven. Everyone loves The Raven. In the afterword of What Moves the Dead, T. Kingfisher talks about the fact that she reread The Fall of the House of Usher for the first time as an adult, and she had some questions, and so she set out to kind of answer those questions in her retelling. And in doing so, she has created an entirely unique and exciting piece of horror. I should also say that this is one of the most effective pieces of horror I have ever read. I read, watch, and play a lot of horror stuff. Horror is my favorite genre of anything, and I'm not always that affected by it. The more you consume, the more numb you feel to the methods of fear, if you like. The ways that horror movies and books and video games try to terrify you. You kind of come to expect certain things. This book left me feeling really shaken and unsettled by the end. And in part, it was the content, the things that were frightening me, but mostly it was down to Kingfisher's incredible ability to frighten. In her language, in her characterization, in her setting and tone, she's amazing. And I can't wait to read more of her stuff. If you've never read the original story, The Fall of the House of Usher is a short tale about an anonymous protagonist who gets a letter from a friend of his, a guy called Roderick Usher. And our protagonist goes to Usher's house, the House of Usher, and there he finds that Roderick and his sister are both sick for some reason. And Roderick's sister Madeline is particularly sick. She's dying. And the house itself is basically split in two. There's a crack running all the way through this enormous mansion from top to bottom. And in that crack, you've got a lot of mushrooms. And again, in the afterword, T. Kingfisher talks about just how often mushrooms are described in that book. Story. Yeah. I read The Fall of the House of Usher several years ago, and I really enjoyed it. I think that it was a very effective piece of creeping gothic dread. It's got a sickness. It's got an almost abandoned old house that's broken and is very much a character in and of itself, and the characters in that story make reference to that as well. And it has an ending that shocks and satisfies, but it didn't satisfy T. Kingfisher, and so what she did was take it upon herself to recreate that story, flesh it out, add a bit of meat to its bones. And I believe that What Moves the Dead is a wonderful homage to The Fall of the House of Usher, while also expanding on it in so many sensible and brilliant ways. Quite often when authors or filmmakers try to recreate something or expand on something, make a sequel or a prequel or a remake, they tarnish the original. Even if they truly love it, and quite often they don't, they just miss something. I don't think T. Kingfisher has missed anything here. This is amazing, and it really, really shook me. What Moves the Dead begins with a protagonist who is this time named, a person called Alex Easton. Alex is a soldier, a dedicated soldier, and the letter that they receive is this time not from Roderick, but his sister Madeline. And on their way to the house, Alex meets this posh British woman who's admiring and sketching the mushrooms in this area. The whole setting is in a kind of marshy land. The House of Usher has a lake beside it, and there are mushrooms growing everywhere. And this British woman remarks on the fact that these mushrooms are very, very dangerous, poisonous, deadly. But she is obsessed with them nonetheless. She is a mycologist, or an amateur one at least. Now when Easton gets to the house, Roderick is surprised to see them. And Alex explains, well, Madeline wrote me a letter. In the letter, Madeline says that Roderick thinks that she's nearly dead. It's nearly her time. She is not long for this world. And so far, this is The Fall of the House of Usher, except Easton has been given a name and a backstory. And they are also a non-binary character, but not in the way that we think of it today, because it is still set presumably in the Victorian period. But as a dedicated soldier, they kind of gave up their gender. and they use specific neopronouns that are specific to the country that they come from. So they're not really neopronouns, but again, that's what we would probably call them now. And that's just a fun little bit of characterization that I really admired. It's not awkward, it's not obtuse, it's fluid and seamless. And it creates a little bit of dynamism in the protagonist. But so far, so Usher. Then we start to unravel what's really going on here. A lot of the specific creeping, gothic mystery elements of the original story are referenced here. The same kind of steps are trodden, but they are explored, they are examined, and a kind of villain is revealed. But I'm using the word villain carefully here, and I really don't want to spoil what exactly this villain is, what exactly T. Kingfisher chooses to create out of the mysteries and darkness that was left by Poe in his original story. She has chosen to answer the questions that she had, and those answers are satisfying and also, suitably, terrifying. So, for the majority of the story, and again, even though this is an expansion of Poe's original short story, it's still only about 170 pages long, so you can read it in a day, like I did. Wait, what was I saying? I can't remember. This is a story that fleshes out every little bit of that original tale. We get a few new characters, like the woman who sketches the mushrooms. We get the mushrooms themselves, and we also get extra bits of fear laced in before this villain is revealed. And one of the most effective moments is about halfway through when we see a bunch of hares. The animal, not hares. And these hares are acting strangely. They're peculiar. And Easton watches one of these hares move. And the way that they describe the movement of this hare is really chilling. The way that it sort of moves its limbs one at a time in a kind of crawling motion across the ground. It genuinely gave me goosebumps. It's such an effective narrative description that you read. And then things get even stranger when it comes to the hares and the mushrooms and more. In the original story, the house was a character. In this, it remains so, and the cracks in it, and the fact that it is crumbling, and the mushrooms that are growing, and the fact that it's almost becoming one with the wild and dangerous landscape that surrounds it, that's all still here. But it's made more poisonous, more venomous, more villainous. And I can't say any more without spoiling it. But this is my first ride with T. Kingfisher. It's a very short story, and it is a retelling of a story that I already read and loved a few years ago. So it was a really nice place for me to start reading her stories, because her other two books are bigger. I've got The Twisted Ones, her debut novel, ready to read, and I can't wait. When I'm done with that, I'll probably make a new video talking about how she's my new favourite. Because if this is anything to go by, and the reception that The Twisted Ones had, I think I've found a new favourite horror author, and that's really exciting. I admire so much the fact that she was willing to tread the ground of one of the great Gothic writers, to pick up a legendary piece of Gothic writing, one of the most famous stories of the Victorian period, one of the most famous stories of the American canon, of the Gothic canon, to actually hold that in her hands and go, I'm going to expand on this. I'm going to answer the questions that I had. I'm going to create something bigger, meatier, even more frightening than what Edgar Allan Poe wrote. That takes a lot of guts, and she did it. She did it so well. She really expertly pulled from other aspects of horror, of the Gothic, even of science fiction in a sense. And she smushed all that together in a big ball of Play-Doh, centered around the fall of the House of Usher at its core. And it is incredible. This is one of the most frightening pieces of horror I have ever read. As I said at the beginning, horror doesn't affect me. I'm addicted to it, I love it. I love the stories, the concepts, the settings, the characters. I love horror, but I'm not often terrified by it. This really shook me, and I'm really grateful to her for that. If you like Edgar Allan Poe, if you love The Fall of the House of Usher, and you've never read T. Kingfisher, whoa, you are in for a wild ride. This is twisted and gross, and I love it. Subscribe for books.